Hello, my name is Sarah Wilhock, and today I'll be doing my presentation on police brutality and what it is in our society today. Let's get to it. What is police brutality? Police brutality is defined as a violation of civil rights that happens when an officer or officers use excessive or undue force against a civilian. While most people only think of violent examples, such as a white male policeman being unnecessarily violent toward an African American person, there are a lot more subtle kinds of police brutality as well. Aside from personal injury, there can be verbal harassment, damage to property, mental taunting, and injury. And the types of these brutality, like I just mentioned, physical violence, mental abuse, harassment, and explicitly racist brutality. And in my presentation today, I'll be going into detail on each of these a little bit and discussing what they are and how they relate to the topic. Physical violence. This is probably the first kind of police brutality that comes to mind when we think of the topic. Trigger happy, looking for a fight or a reason to hit a victim, almost bully-like individuals. They respond with excessive force to instances where much milder methods could be employed, like after a car chase when an officer pulls the driver out of the vehicle and sucker punches them. Any time when physical violence is unneeded and they use it regardless is a blatant abuse of the power that they hold with their badge. Harassment. Harassment is another major issue that revolves around the police. Harassment can be anything from intimidation, yelling, threatening, or cursing at a victim, unwarranted seizure of property, unwarranted surveillance or searches, blackmail, coerced false confession, and many more things. Mental abuse. I think this is an aspect of the police brutality that often gets overlooked. Probably because it is less commonly seen, it is a much harder thing to see or prove than actual physical injury. Mental abuse is just what it says, but coming from a police officer. When they use racial or derogatory language when dealing with civilians, or they belittle an individual or group without reason. As they are civil servants sworn to serve and protect, belittling or psychologically attacking those they are there to aid and protect is inexcusable. Racial violence. Unfortunately, this is the most common type of brutality, especially in the USA today. Because of our society and our history, we have a great deal of racism embedded in our culture. Film and media have managed to eradicate some, but we will never fully be free of it. And in some ways, film and media almost promotes it. Most crime series and live cop shows show mainly footage of police in city settings, arresting the stereotypical criminal African American male. And in our American culture today, we tend to demonize certain groups, and in the world of crime, we do home in on the African American male. Like it was mentioned in an interview in Bowling for Columbine, a film documentary by Michael Moore, our film industry plays heavily on stereotypes. In the interview, when the crime show's producer was asked why the main suspects of the show were usually African American men, and they were shown as the main culprits, they replied with, "That's what they've always done, and because there's simply more of it." Which I don't know if necessarily is true depending on where you are, because we tend to focus more on these stereotypes. And in a PBS News article, they talked about a poll done by Jen Ford, in which they found that over 24% of young black people reported that they had been unduly harassed by the police, and this was mainly because of the fact that they simply had a different skin color. They did a similar poll and found that the reason for this was that, and that young white people of the same age bracket were African American teens of that age bracket were twice as likely to have had to deal with police and possibly get harassed than young white people of the same age bracket. And why is there police brutality? Well, there are many explanations for police brutality. A lot of them are sadly because of racial agendas and biases, control complexes, fear and violence, and anger tendencies. While other times, people simply join the police force as a way of getting back at certain groups, or using it as an outlet for their own personal issues. The thing we think of the most is the awful cop who abuses his power given by his badge, and that just gives him some sort of satisfaction. But we forget about the fact that sometimes these occurrences aren't the actions of a bad or corrupt cop that's always out to get everyone. Sometimes they are just the accidental slip-up of a human being. We can easily overlook the fact that these men and women are people just like us. Sometimes it's not because they're inherently evil. They have emotions and reactions to things just like the rest of us, and they may not always be the right reactions. We all have bad days, and in a police officer's daily life, they deal with the worst in people, and it builds up. After having a terrible day, they may have to deal with a particularly mouthy person who just strikes a nerve, or maybe a violent person who says something and then attacks them, and in that moment they just snap. It does not make that right in any way, but it is something that happens to all human beings, not just to them. But as they are held to higher standards, we tend to be a little more harsh in our judgments. Uncalled for police violence will always be wrong. When it does happen because of simple human emotions and error, we can know that it's wrong, but still be understanding as human beings. And here are my sources used for the police brutality. I did some information on what research says about police and race shootings, police harassment and a citizen's constitutional rights. Nearly a quarter of the young black people who have said they've been harassed by the police, and Bowling for Columbine. And that's my presentation. And that's it. Sarah Wilhock.